Hi, everyone. My name is Will Ruth. This is Essential Rowing Movements. We're going to spend the next hour to hour and a half talking about hip hinge and shoulder coordination. I tuned in just at the end of what Jeremy was talking about. And so we're going to basically pick up right where he left off with talking about the movements that we need to have down in the gym or the basic physical movements in order to achieve positions in the stroke. So the hip hinge and the shoulder coordination are a big part of that. And so we're going to get right into that. Here's a little bit about me first. I started life as a skinny junior lightweight rower. Went to college, thought that I left the sport behind, started competing in strength sports while studying in the exercise science program. I interned with a couple college teams and knew a lot of the rowers on the Western Washington University men's team. And so I would help them out when I saw them in the weight room. And gradually they asked if I wanted to work with the rest of the team, start riding along in the coaches launch. I did. And I ended up being there for 5 more years as the strength coach and also as the assistant on water coach. My wife got a job here in central Vermont last year. We made the move, and now I'm a guest coach at the Craftsbury Sculling Center, which is a high performance program, a U23 program, and also week and weekend long camp programs during the summer, during non-pandemic summers for rowers of all ages and levels. You might have seen me already online under the rowingstronger.com website or my earlier website of Strength Coach Will. So the goals of today are to learn why the hip hinge and the shoulder movements are crucial to rowing technique, performance, and reducing risk of injury. And number 2, how to learn and connect these movements on the erg and on the water and train and build them with strength training. So when we talk about these things, here's what we're talking about. On the left here, we've got the hip hinge. The hip hinge is the basis of all deadlift exercises, demonstrated here by one of our athletes on the Western team. The hip hinge has to be down in order to have good rowing technique, especially body angle and reach on the recovery, and then solid drive sequencing. So we will talk more about that one. And then the shoulder movements is basically mastering the movement of the shoulder through the 4 ways that the shoulder moves. So if we don't access all those ranges of motion, and in the top picture, I'm showing what the shoulder looks like when it's up and forward versus when in the bottom picture, the shoulder is back and down. So what we're going to do from here is go through each one of these hip hinge movements from both how we learn it and access it on the erg, as well as when the errors show up, how to learn them on land. And then we're going to do the same for the shoulder movements, and then we'll come back to both of them for how to strength train for both of those movements. So you are welcome to get on the erg as we're talking and go through it. Or if you just want to watch, then that's totally fine too. So there'll be interactive opportunities as we go. All right. Why care about the hip hinge and the shoulder movements? Well, because if you don't, then your stroke looks like this. So there's some errors present in each of these pictures that I tie back down to hip hinge and shoulder movement dysfunction. So on the far left one here, you can see that I've got my shoulders rolled forward. This is causing my elbows to flare out really wide. So those are both shoulder dysfunctions. And then at the seat level, you can see that I'm sitting way back on my tailbone, and then my lumbar spine or low back is rounded out. Then this magnifies as we go through the recovery phase as the shoulders lunge forward or shove forward into this forward and rounded position. That causes the back to round, which causes the hips to round instead of achieving that nice rock over. At the catch, this gets even worse because as the boat forces are all going this way, the athlete lunges extra. Now we're in a bad position to take the strain, either the chain on the erg or the force of the water, and then it just repeats. Since rowing is a cyclical motion, it's really important that we get each of these stages down because one error compounds and rolls over into the next one. This also sets us up. This is bad for technique, obviously. If you've got some errors present in these pictures, your coach might be saying in the far left one, sit up at the release, bring the elbows in, all the technical stuff that coaches are always talking about. I tie a lot of it down, not to technical problems, but to a lack of physical understanding of how to move the body on land and a mastery of these movements before we actually even get in the boat, because it's hard to make changes when we're either erging at full pressure under high fatigue, or rowing with other athletes around you, other things affecting your technique, balance, set, trying to keep up. There's a lot going on. So we'll talk about how I use strength training, but mastery of basic movements is a huge part of that. It's also really important for performance. So the best technique is also going to be the best for performance over 2,000 meters. So where we're talking about getting any inch extra of drive, any extra power on the stroke, it's really important that we're doing those through good movement sequencing. It's also really important for reducing risk of injuries. So in all of these positions, we have risk of injuries. In the far left, with the shoulders rolled forward, puts a lot of stress on the rib cage, does not keep the pressure on the muscles of the back and of the arms through the drive. Same thing as we go through this with the hips rounding over, that's a major risk of low back pain. So we're going to be talking about through this presentation of the intersection of good technique, rowing performance in terms of splits and times, and then reducing risk of injuries. The hip hinge can also be referred to as lumbopelvic coordination by strength coaches or physical therapists who want to sound fancy. Again, just from the earlier picture here, it's the position of the hips going back while the torso goes forward. I've got a video on the next slide of demonstrating this and a few of the errors. One of the really basic cues that I like to use for the hip hinge is just the drinking bird toy. This is a pretty solid hip hinge, right? We've got a little bit of bend in the knees. I guess the bird's knees are technically going backwards, so that's not ideal, but we would have a little bit of bend in the knees and then a nice straight torso with the action coming around the hip at the pivot point, not from the spinal segments or from the shoulders. So if you ever need just like a good visual cue, I think that's a nice one just to get that solid torso angle. So here's what it looks like on the erg. And this is where we're going to pick up basically right where Jeremy left off. So here's the bad first, right? This looks like the pictures that I just showed of bad technique with no hip hinge. All of the reach on the recovery and the power on the drive is coming from the spine and from the shoulders. So here's the good. Now we've got our drinking bird going. The pivot point is the hip, not the spinal segments. And we're sitting up nice and tall with the rock over. I think it's really important that we start at the recovery, because whatever happens at the recovery is going to happen more as we get into the drive and the catch. So here's again, just like the ways that it can go wrong as we come up the slide from that bad rock over position. And then if we start with a good rock over, then we can put it all together with the rest of the stroke. So that's what the hip hinge looks like on the erg. If any of those bad techniques looked like you and you want to fix it, again, where I like to start is not with more and more drills on the erg. I think the erg is great to like realize where that technique is important, but then it's really important that we work with feet on the ground in a solid, focused environment. So I've got 2 drills here for the hip hinge, and you're welcome to try these as we go. The first one is just me demonstrating the movement. So here's what we're looking for. You can see my hips are going back while my torso goes forward. Again, the pivot point is the hip, not the spinal segments. So you can again see the drinking bird. So you can do this either going back to like a post or just back to the wall, standing a little bit away from it and pushing the hips back until you make contact. I'm going to show a couple errors here. If you just bend forward, now the motion's coming from the spinal segment, not from the hip joint, and we're not going to be able to touch the wall. If you just squat down, same thing. So the hip hinge is the in-between point of the torso going forward and the hips going down. You can also do this if you have a PVC pipe or a lacrosse stick or a broom handle or anything. This is another one of my favorite drills. We get 3 points of contact. Mid-back 1, top of the head 1, and then like the top of the glutes as the other. So you've got your hand on the small of the back holding it there. And then from there, we're just going to go through the same hip hinge motion. And we're going to maintain those 3 points of contact the whole time. I'll show what happens when we lose one of those points. As soon as we lose one of those points, then we're transferring motion to the spinal segments instead of getting it through the hip joint and the lower body. So this is just a really nice reminder on what the hip hinge looks like. This is not the hip hinge. You can see I've got no points of contact or just one point of contact. And then same thing, if you just squat down, then we can maintain our 3 points of contact, but it looks awkward as heck. So that's the simplest way to get the hip hinge technique down with your feet on the ground. So the shoulder motion, just like the hip hinge, had the fancy word of lumbo-pelvic coordination for the lumbar spine and the pelvis. Shoulder coordination has a fancy one that's scapulohumeral rhythm. And I've got a video here just in case anybody in the audience is an anatomy nerd and wants to know what's going on at the musculoskeletal level. Scapula is shoulder blade, and then humerus or humeral is the arm bone, the humerus. So what we're describing with scapulohumeral rhythm is how those two move. And this is what's happening at a muscular level. There's a lot going on there just to get your arm to raise up to the side or to go forward and backward. It's really important that all these muscles are doing their individual jobs in order to make this work. So again, that's what's going on subconsciously whenever you move your arm up and down. And I just find that stuff fascinating. So here's what it looks like on the erg. So scapulohumeral rhythm, what we're always looking for is that the shoulder joint, the scapula, the shoulder blades can be stable while the humerus, the arm bone, and therefore the rest of the arm moves around that stable shoulder joint. So here's a couple things that happen if your shoulder joint's not stable, but your arms move anyway. So hold on. Here's first the bad of scapulohumeral rhythm on the erg, which is you see I kick my shoulders up first. So I go straight to the upper traps, those muscles right on top of your shoulders. And I'm obviously exaggerating it here, but you see this a lot with people where the hands aren't leading the body is leading the hands. So this is, again, like, I'm not sure that it's effective to approach this just from a drill perspective, because there's a lot going on here at a muscular perspective. So here's the good of now we see that the hands and the arms are leading the body. So this is just, again, from the back end of the stroke. We also see this at mid drive. You see, again, I'm kicking up that high shoulder area is the first thing to move. And what we want is a nice smooth draw. So some coaches will also approach this as, a handle height issue or a blade work issue. And again, I just see it so much more as a muscular and as a coordination issue. That this is where I'd always prefer to start with an athlete is, do we understand what the muscles and the segments are doing? And do we have control over those? This also happens when you come into the front end. Here I've got this nice big reach. So this is what Jeremy was just talking about with, I think it can be a flexibility issue of the athlete trying to overreach, but it can also be a strength issue of not having enough strength in those shoulder muscles to maintain a stable shoulder joint while the arm moves. What we want is what I'm demonstrating now, which is a smooth action at the catch. Any movement that happens at the shoulder blade here as we start the drive is wasted because it's not getting through to the handle. If the force that we're generating at the foot plate isn't getting through our entire kinetic chain to the handle in a smooth way, then we're losing performance with every stroke. So we can get free speed basically here by just cleaning up to have a stable shoulder joint so that we can get all of our lower body power actually to the handle and to the blade. So here's those 4 shoulder movements. So this is, again, where you're welcome to work through it on the erg. I think this is one area where it's really clear to see. The first one we're going to start with is just from the neutral position of sitting with the shoulders just where they're comfortable, and then we can raise them up. That's movement number 1. Back to neutral, and then down. Down is movement number 2. The third one is one that people might not be familiar with, and that's just forward. Back to neutral, and then backwards. So those are just, I'll go through this again here, and you can do this either yourself, just sitting with your arms out in front of you like a zombie, or on the erg. Up, and then down, and then forward, and then backward. So I think of this as, like, a lot of my role as a strength coach as being like an advanced PE teacher. We all had PE of doing jumping jacks and calisthenics and basic movements, but a lot of us didn't have PE unless you had strength training for how to actually develop force from those muscles. So now we're going through like, here's how the muscles move, and here's how our technique's affected, and here's how we can actually control the joints through all those ranges of motion for force production and for sport performance. I think it's really important that we're providing opportunities to practice all of that. So I'm going to show the next two here. We've got our four-way shoulder movement, but the shoulders also move. The shoulders also can do those movements together. So we've done up, down, forward, backward. Next, what we're going to do is forward and up. This would be called protraction. And then we can go back and down together for retraction. And you see that like the handle's moving up and down a little bit, but most of this movement is happening just from the shoulder joint itself. So again, just play with those, because if we don't know that that those movements are there, then it's really hard to then say, okay, now we're going to do it perfectly, stroke after stroke, under pressure in a race for 2,000 meters, or that we're going to be able to strength train without first having access to how all those muscles and joints move. On land, one of my favorite exercises is the YWT raise. Here we're going to make the letters just like the song YMCA, but we're going to do Y, W, and T. So if you're looking at it from the front, that's what it looks like. I'm going to demonstrate the good and the bad technique for the exercise from each letter at a time. We do this from the hip hinge position too, so that we can basically build in a little bit more practice there. The more forward you hinge, the more pressure or the more muscular effort there's going to be on the shoulder muscles. So start from this hinge position, thumbs up the whole time, and then what we're working on is putting the shoulders back and down as we go through this movement. So think about shoulder blades in the back pockets. That's a cue that I'll use a lot for this, because we want to keep it out of the upper traps, out of the upper shoulder muscles. And here's what I'm demonstrating on this one is now I'm kicking the shoulders up first and really taking the pressure with the upper traps instead of with the low and the middle traps. So here's again the good technique: thumbs pointing up to the sky, shoulders back and down. It's not a challenge for how high you can raise your hands. What we're trying to do here is just activate those little muscles in between your shoulder blades. And then here's the bad: shrugging up, a lot of emphasis in the upper traps. Next one is the W. And here again, we're just going to keep wrist straight in line with elbows, making a W if you were to look at us from the front. And then again, shoulders back and down through the whole time. Here I'm showing shoulders up and shoulders forward. You can see my wrists not in line with my elbows, and I'm taking a lot of the pressure at the upper traps. So I'll back it up here so you can try it yourself. The W raise. And here's the bad. Okay, next one we're going to do is the T. So here again, we're going to keep thumbs pointing up, not thumbs up as in forward, but thumbs up as in to the sky. And then same thing, shoulders back and down. If you're doing this as we go, you should really feel this between the shoulder blades and also in the rear area of the shoulder, not in the upper traps like I'm demonstrating now. You can see my thumbs are rolling forward. I'm getting the motion into the upper shoulder. And the other thing that I like to do with all these positions is just get to that point and hold it. And we could feel it wrong and we could feel it right. So let me show that again. We get up into this top position, we hold it there for a second, round them up and forward, and just feel how wrong that is from a stroke technique perspective. And then go into that nice thumbs to the sky, shoulder back and down in the back pockets, and just feel the difference and the contrast between those two positions. I think that's a really effective teaching technique for actually learning what feels wrong and then better being able to feel what feels right. Does anybody have any questions about either of those skills before we go to putting it together on the erg with the drill?
So there's one question, Will. It says, if we overreach at the catch to the point of slouching a bit with the shoulders, what should we do because of it?
everything in this presentation. So figure
Yep.
out where that's coming from, right? Is that coming from the back end of the stroke and the first move that you make out of the recovery, or sorry, into the recovery? Because if the shoulders are up and forward as you start the recovery, it's only getting worse as you approach the catch. And then once you've got the blade in the water, once you're coming up to the blade prep, putting the blade in the water at the catch, then we don't really have an opportunity to correct things again. So that's why I always start from the back end, and let's make sure that the hands are leading the arms, and then the arms are leading the body, and that everything else flows smoothly from there. Then this next drill is going to be helpful for you too. It could also happen if you're in a good position at the mid drive and then you lunge forward and throw your shoulders into the catch, the way that I showed in the video at the front end. Then it might be a strength issue. That's where I see it most often, is that athletes just lack strength in either the torso muscles to keep the torso nice and upright, or they lack strength in the shoulder muscles to maintain that back and down position. Because we can't just get there once and then call it good. We've got to do it 200 plus times in a race. And we've got opportunities to do that every time in training too. So this next drill is going to be really helpful for seeing actually where that error is coming from and how we can fix it. So this is the neutral spine drill, one of my favorites for teaching all these concepts together. I'll give everybody a sec to get on the erg, and I'll show it through once, and then we can play it again, give a little bit of time for anybody to do it themselves. What we're going to do is get into basically our sitting upright and then into the release position. We're going to do it with our hands behind our head. And I show on this, we want, again, shoulders back and down from this position. So here's right. And then wrong would be up and forward. So that's obviously exaggerated, but find that position and then rock back to your rock back position. And then just hold that for a second and feel what it feels like to sit at the release, torso engaged, or abs engaged, pressure on the foot plate, right? Let's put all of our skills together here. Pressure on the foot plate, torso engaged, shoulders back and down. Is that position what it feels like when you're rowing usually? If not, there's a leak somewhere in there. If you don't have pressure on the foot plate when you're rowing usually, and you've got a lot of pressure on the foot strap, then we've got a lot of pressure sitting on the back of the boat. And so that's no good. If you're slumped at the lumbar, usually if your low back is rounded out, then we might have a hip hinge problem. So let's dial that in. If the shoulders are usually forward and the elbows are flared, then that's coming back to the shoulder area. So now let's play through it here. What we're going to do is just rock back and forth. So hit that layback position, dial it in, get to your body over position. So we're practicing keeping the shoulder in that stable joint back and down. And then we're also practicing just the motion of the hip hinge as we rock forward. So I'll just show it again here from getting into the position, just rocking through the back end from the, whatever you call it, some coaches will call it like the 11 o'clock position at the back end, the release, to the 1 o'clock position to the rock over. And we're just working on feeling that through the hip hinge motion with the shoulder back and down. Then from there, we can start to come up the rest of the slide. So get to that body over position and then just work it the rest of the way. And you can go real slow and feel each segment. So they're segmented out a little bit more. And try to make it feel like what it's going to feel like when you're actually rowing or on the erg. And so if you notice that it's really hard to hold your shoulders back and down as you approach the catch, then there's that hint of the restriction being at the catch side, not at the release side. So we can start, this is one of my favorite drills for troubleshooting stroke problems, because it can show us really quickly, can the athlete keep the shoulders back and down, but it's the hip hinge that's weak, or is the hip hinge strong, but the shoulder motion is what starts to break down. As they get to the catch, does the athlete rock or round forward from the shoulders, or are they able to maintain a nice neutral spine the way that I am there? So what I'll do is I'll go like 5 to 10 reps at the back end, and then 5 to 10 reps going through the whole stroke cycle, and then put the handle in your hands and go through another 5 to 10 strokes actually rowing it and trying to feel those positions at each phase. And then that gives us information where we need to work more, either from a technical perspective and or from a physical perspective. And I'll use this drill in the warm up too. We'll do the full body warm up, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And then we'll get on the erg, just dial in all those positions, and then actually start erging lightly with that. Like, we've done the immediate physical reminder of what correct feels like. Then we're going into the erg instead of trying to work backwards from like, okay, now there's an error. Now we got to figure that out while we're still erging. Now we're going to do this drill. I'll just start with this as like our post warm up pre-erg drill.
How do you retain this good hip hinge and mobility during race pace or just higher rates in general on the erg? I find it hard to focus on technique and hitting splits / executing my split plan at the same time.
Yep. At the same time is the tricky part of that. I think that we've got to be intentional about what we're trying to achieve when. So when we say we're going to do this piece for technical work now, we need to focus on technique and not be as worried about our splits. If you use heart rate, that's one of my favorite ways to use heart rate training, because your heart rate's going to be the same regardless of whether you're using good technique or slop technique. So it takes the split out of the equation, and we can just go off of heart rate with the best technique that we can achieve. When we're racing or doing a test piece, I don't find it productive to burden the athlete with a lot of technical cues. So that's why we need to have all that practice time built up, focusing on technique, focusing on hitting those good movement patterns, working on it on land, in strength training, and on the erg, and in the boat, so that then when you race, you can put it all out of your head and just focus on the effort of it. I really think it's a tough ask to tell athletes, make sure when you're 1750 in and starting your sprint that you're activating your mid traps and your shoulders are backing down. The time for that is past, not only because the coach isn't out there. That was one of the funniest things for me when I came back to coaching rowing. I also used to coach lacrosse, where I could call a timeout and put in a play or give an athlete a reminder of something. When I was coaching rowing, you hand them their oars and say, see you in 45 minutes, have a nice race. So we need to make sure that the athlete understands all this stuff on land, on the erg, has opportunities to practice it in a technical focused training environment. And then when you race, focus on racing, and hopefully all those skills are maintained. But we need to build opportunities in practice in order to expect that to happen. Yeah, let's get into strength training, because that's another important piece of the puzzle. And so I'll talk here about like what I use strength training for and what I don't use strength training for. And I think this will give the person who asked the last question some clues too. So the things that I use strength training for are, first and foremost, improving movement patterns. So it doesn't matter to me how much you can squat or deadlift if the technique's not going to transfer over to on-water rowing. If you want to care about your squat and your deadlift max, then go compete in powerlifting or another strength sport. I compete in strongman and it's super fun, but when you're rowing, we need to focus on that and getting the most out of it at a movement pattern level, not at a just yanking the weight around level. The other main importance for strength training is generating and transferring stroke force with muscle and keeping all of that stroke force off of the skeleton. So remember from my earlier picture and the videos of the bad technique, when we're rounded over at the lumbar spine because we're not achieving the movement through the hip hinge, or when we're shoulders are shoved forward, that's all a lot of pressure going directly onto your shoulder joint, onto the rib cage, and onto the spine. And it's no wonder that the most common injury for rowers is low back pain, because if we're achieving that movement through spinal flexion and extension rather than through the hip hinge, and you heard a lot from my good friend Joe DeLeo about this with his spine hygiene webinar, if we're moving through flexion and extension and not through hip hinging, then that's just force going onto the spinal structures, not onto the muscles that we can use to generate and transfer stroke force. Same thing with rib cage. When the shoulders are shoved forward, that's a lot of pressure just going onto the rib cage instead of keeping it in all those big mid back and rear shoulder muscles that we can use to much more effectively generate and transfer stroke force. Then once we've got the movement patterns down, once the technique is good, the athlete has experience with this, then we start getting into increasing loading capacity. So then we're talking about building muscular force, building general force. If we can increase your peak force, then the amount of effort required to maintain submaximal force becomes lower. And the example that I like to use for that is if you've ever watched the NFL Combine, the athletes who get the most reps with the 225-pound bench press test are the athletes with the biggest 1-rep maxes. So that makes sense, right? If you can bench 500 pounds, then 225 pounds is a much lower percentage of your total force than if your max is 245 pounds and you're trying to do 225 for reps. So the same idea on water, obviously like the numbers don't work out quite as cleanly, but if we take the amount of stroke force required per stroke, or we can use watts or something like that, and then we look at our peak watts and our peak force, if we're trying to maintain a really high percentage of our peak force, it's going to be tough. So we got to build the peak force with strength training and then use all the aerobic training, all the rowing work, all that to build the floor of muscular endurance. Especially as you're young too, building muscular size is really important because that's where the mitochondria are stored. So if we assume that aerobic power, aerobic performance is largely tied to mitochondrial density. Everybody knows just do steady state, improve your mitochondrial density, all that stuff. Well, what about improving your mitochondrial storage capacity? If we have bigger muscles, up to a point, if we have bigger muscles, then we can fit more mitochondria into the cells and have better aerobic power when we do all the density work on top of that. And then the final point is availability over ability. So that's again what I was saying is like availability means being able to get in the boat and give it your best in practice and in racing. And that's more important than ability in terms of like adding an extra 10 pounds to your max. So adding 10 pounds to your max only matters if you're healthy enough on race day to display that extra strength and that extra power. So we're always thinking strength training, like this is an asymmetrical risk. We always want to focus the athlete's ability on the rowing and on the erging, do enough strength training to gain adaptation, but being aware that adding 10 pounds to your max only matters if you can actually display that when it's important at practice and on race day. So things that I don't use strength training for are simulating rowing or erging. So I don't do 7-minute bench pull stuff because that works the muscles the way, and we get all of that from erging and from rowing already. So I use, again, strength training to build movements, build peak force, and increase loading capacity. We get all the specific rowing training and all the specific erging training from actual erging rowing. We also don't use strength training to crush you. This is a big difference where we're looking at like general fitness stuff, or if you're used to CrossFit style lifting or whatever, where it's like, that's the focus of those athletes. Most days athletes should be feeling better walking out of a strength training session than they felt walking in. And again, come back to our main 4 points for why. And then I also don't think the strength training is particularly useful for evaluating rowing ability because again, like how much weight you can lift only matters if you can actually display that with good technique and good fitness. So I'd much rather look at like erg performance. You can use a 7-stroke max or a 10-stroke max to see your peak power. And then you can use those tests every 4 to 6 weeks while you're strength training to see that carryover. I think that matters a lot more than just looking at like, oh, well, my 1-rep max went up. Yeah, but did you get any better on the erg or on the water? So that's like the big general picture of strength training. From here, what I'm going to do is go into some specific exercises for the hip hinge and how I train those, and then specific exercises for the shoulder movements and how I train those. Any questions coming in before I get going?
I have one question just because you brought it up.
Yep.
How specifically do you set up your max watt tests? Like if from start to finish, if you had a practice with an athlete or these athletes want to try to see what their max watts look like while they're training on their own, how would you advise them to set that up?
There are the main difference is in the drag factor you use. And I know there's some coaches who like to use your same drag factor that you're training with, whether 110, 120, whatever it is. And then there's other coaches who like to go to full resistance and use 200. I don't think it really matters as long as you're consistent between the two. So whatever your test conditions are the first time you do it, those are the test conditions that you need to keep the next time and the next time and the next time. So I don't really care about drag factor. Whichever one you want to use is fine. I can see pros and cons to both. The important things are that if we're using a 7-stroke or a 10-stroke, we stick to a 7-stroke or a 10-stroke. Offhand, I prefer the 7 because it's a slightly shorter time. And so it's more slanted towards strength training benefits, whereas the 10 stroke can get a little bit longer, more into the anaerobic system. But anyway, that's sort of a fine point. Again, either one you use is fine as long as it's consistent. Start from a dead stop. So not like building into it, but basically you're just trying to go straight from the start as much as you can. And then you can look at peak as in the highest stroke that you achieve. And you can also look at average from the screen data afterwards in terms of like average power. Does that?
Yes.
Yeah. Full slide is the other important thing. I know that like if you just go half slide, but I want the most similar technique possible so that we can keep that as consistent as possible on subsequent trainings.
Yeah.
And then I'll test this like every 4 to 6 weeks tops. If we test it all the time, we don't actually give ourselves enough time to see improvement from it.
Yep. And do you say, you have 7 strokes, you're looking for your max watts of 3 sets or just one time?
We can do one time with athletes who are very experienced in it, but usually I'll take 3 sets and then either take the best score or the average score of the top 3, whichever one we're going to be consistent with.
Yep. Cool. Great. Otherwise, no other questions. We're good to keep moving.
But that's again, like that's my favorite way to see if strength training is working, because it puts us in the specific stroke pattern where we want to see performance. And it encourages us to keep the goal in the strength training, always trying to build stroke movement, stroke power.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yep. On to the exercises then. I've got a link here to my YouTube channel. These are just examples of the different exercises that I use and the coaching cues. So they're all like 2 to 3 minutes long tops. And it just gives you examples of each of these. I've also got them embedded in the presentation, but if you want to go back and look at it later, I hope that this will be a handy resource for you. We'll start with the hip hinge. What I've got here is my general progression for teaching the hip hinge. So I start beginners, and so I know everybody's working with different equipment, but I've got different opportunities for how to learn and develop these basic exercises. With a beginner, obviously we start with just like getting the movement down. When we start actually loading it, we'll use a single dumbbell or a single kettlebell hinge exercise. We'll use a band or a cable pull through, and then we'll use a 1-arm or a 1-leg hinge, just unloaded, just trying to get that movement down. Again, videos of all this coming next. Just wanted to lay out the general pathway first. Intermediate, then we'll go to a double dumbbell or a double kettlebell hinge, or we'll get into the barbell Romanian deadlift, which is just the top half of the deadlift. Advanced athletes, now we start going down to the floor, because that increases the coordination requirements a lot. From in the early stages, we're just working on the hinge ability and the hinge muscles. Advanced athletes, we can start to actually put this together with the whole system, more similar to how we're going to use it in the stroke, where we've got to get all the way up from the catch with a good leg drive and then a torso swing, similar with these deadlift variations. I like to use an elevated deadlift where I'll bring the bar up to like just below the knees, because again, there we're focusing on the hinge, but we're doing it from a dead stop. The barbell deadlift used to be one of my favorites, but has become not so much my favorite, mostly because it's easy for rowers to cheat and do poorly. So if I have the option to use a hex bar, and again, I've got a video of this coming up next, a hex bar deadlift puts the athlete in a more upright torso position, and it's also a lot harder to cheat. So barbell deadlift's okay if that's all you have. My preference for advanced athletes is going to be used at elevated deadlift or a hex bar. So let's see these exercises in order of progression. Starting at the beginner level, this is the single dumbbell or the single kettlebell if you have kettlebells, hinge. So here we're again just working that motion with a bit of load. You'll notice that the bell goes straight down between my legs. Here I'm showing it wrong, and the bell's swinging way out in front. And you can see now I'm getting the motion through the spine rather than through the hips. This is then the squat, which is the other direction of wrong. So remember that we always want to be finding that midpoint between bending the torso forward and squatting down. So here's again what it looks like done correctly. Really important that we get this down with relatively low load and just working on the single dumbbell before we progress to the other exercises. This is the band pull through. You can also do it with a cable machine. This was actually a good thing for the shutdown because it's better to do privately, not making eye contact when you're at the gym doing this exercise, but nonetheless, it's a good opportunity to train the posterior chain muscles of the hinge, low back, glutes, hamstrings. One of my favorites for teaching and progressing that. This is the one arm, the one leg hinge. And so here we've got we've got a straight line from head to hip to heel, or as close as we can. And this is just a different way to train the hinge that increases the challenge because we're putting all of our body weight through one leg rather than through both legs. So that increases the difficulty based on the amount of load we're using. Now we can also load it a little bit. Now we're working hip stability more to keep everything in line. And so if you've just got one dumbbell and you're trying to, okay, how the heck do I get work out of this? The one arm, one leg hinge is a great way to do it. Now we're going up to the intermediate level, and I've got 2 dumbbells in my hands. You notice I'm still keeping my hands really close to my legs and close to my thighs through the whole movement, not swinging them out in front of me. Even as we go up to 2 dumbbells or 2 kettlebells and then up to the barbell, we want to keep the same thing. So here's the barbell hinge, also called the Romanian deadlift. Again, we're just working that same hinge motion, but we're just increasing the loading of it with higher weight. So there's beginner to intermediate. And I joked with Sarah about this before. I filmed all of these videos in about 2 hours. And it was about 90 degrees, humid. I was outside in the sun. So you're watching my gray shirts turn into a black shirt as we go through this. But that was the beginner to intermediate progression. So most important that we're just working on the hinge motion and just getting that down as we increase the loading of it. So then we get into the advanced variations of the elevated deadlift, also called like the block pull. You might be familiar with it that way. And then we're going to start it from a dead stop. So that's increasing the starting force demands of this, but we're still doing it mostly from that top half hinge position. Here's the regular barbell deadlift from the floor. So you see, we increase the range of motion, we increase the challenge of the exercise. So that's why this is the more advanced athlete. But from the knees up, this is all the same motion. So that's why it's really important that we get the hip hinge motion down, not just for erg technique, but also for the rest of lifting technique. So here's some bad examples that I often see of very little hinge, lots of spinal and shoulder rounding. So this is not doing anything to contribute to our boat performance. The other way that this can go wrong is people like go the other direction. They turn it into a squat. And so they're really overextended. You can see my face, it just feels really awkward. So if you do the barbell deadlift, remember that we want to find that midpoint in between the squat and in between the torso forward. This is the hex bar that I talked about. My favorite deadlift for rowers. It gets us into a slightly more upright torso position. It's a little bit more like in between a squat and a true hinge, but while still requiring both. And I found a lot better carryover for rowing performance from this. It also gives us the opportunity to use the high handles, which I really like, especially for athletes who are over like 6'2", because the deadlift is the one exercise that like everybody starts out at the same height off the ground. And so if you're like me and you're 5'8", that's a big advantage versus somebody who is 6'2". So I like to use the high handles there. Questions on any of the hinge exercises, the progression in general?
We have another question. What do you do? What to do if your back hurts during the hex bar RDL?
So I don't use the hex bar for the RDL or the Romanian deadlift because it does get really hard to control. So if the athlete's using a hex bar for an RDL, then that might be the reason alone. And I would encourage using a different exercise, either a straight bar or the dumbbell or the kettlebell version if that's available. If all you have is the hex bar, then I probably wouldn't do an RDL at all, and I would just do deadlifts from the floor with it. Since the bar is 3 dimensions and it can go behind you and in front of you, it's really, really hard to stabilize the torso to keep it in line as you go through that hinge. If the question is slightly different and it was just if your back hurts when doing any hinge or any deadlift, I would regress the exercise by going to a simpler version and making sure that we have a really solid hip hinge. And then if the athlete can display the excellent hip hinge technique, but it still causes pain, then I say I'm a strength coach, not a physical therapist, and I refer it to a medical professional. I think, did you all have the Karen Calera webinar already on rib stress injuries?
Yeah, we did. We did.
Karen, I've gotten to work with her personally. She was about an hour and a half south of me when I was coaching, and she would come up and work with our team. She is amazing. She's a physical therapist. She has 20 plus years of experience with rowers and rowing, and she can solve those problems so much faster than a strength coach or a rowing coach can. So I have a ton of respect for the PT, and if I can't fix it with like basic movement stuff, then I refer out to a PT, because we want to figure out exactly what's going on. If the hip hinge hurts you when you're just on land, that's going to show up when you're on water too. And we're going to start seeing other movement compensations that happen that's bad for technique, bad for performance, and is going to increase risk of other injuries.
One more question. Are power cleans a good exercise for rowing?
I don't love the power clean. One exercise that I don't have in this progression is the kettlebell swing, and I prefer the kettlebell swing over the power clean for rowers because it works that same explosive hip hinge motion that we want, but without all of the kind of other technical demands of the power clean. The power clean comes from Olympic lifting, and Olympic lifters spend their whole lives trying to get really, really good at the Olympic lifts. And there's a lot of little technical stuff going on, from the way the bar contacts the hips to how you catch it at the shoulders and at the wrists. And there's just opportunities for all that to go wrong. And rowing's a technical enough sport as it is. So I'm always wary of like, how much am I overburdening athletes with doing a bunch of technical work in the gym if I can get the same physical stimulus to make them a better rower from a simpler exercise. So the kettlebell swing, or even just doing like explosive Romanian deadlifts where we're just working the top half of the hinge, but we're doing it with that snappy hip movement. Those would be my preferences over the power clean, just because it's technically simpler and it doesn't, I'm just not sure the power clean carries over to rowing well enough to be worth all the extra effort in teaching, learning, and practicing. The one Olympic lift version that I will use is called a high pull. There's a video of that on my channel, not in this progression, but it's basically just the hinge part and then a little bit of pull from the upper bodies, but not going all the way into the catch position of the power clean. I've just seen too many athletes jam wrists or miss the catch and the bar slides down the arms and stuff. And then I've got to go tell the rowing coach that, this athlete's out for a week with a wrist injury, because I was doing power cleans. It's like availability over ability. Is that worth the risk if it might take you out of the boat for a week? Not for me. So we'll go to the shoulder next. And I treat the shoulder a little bit differently. I don't have with the hip hinge, I have a pretty set progression for things that I want to achieve with beginner athletes before I consider them intermediate. Then we start loading it heavier using higher weight variations. And then with advanced athletes, we can bring the range of motion up and also bring the weight up. With the shoulder coordination, I do sort of all of it a little bit more as we go. So I've got this roughly ranked from like least difficult to most difficult. So there's some progression here of like, I want to make sure that beginners are getting the body weight or the very lightly loaded YWT raise down. The band or cable pull apart and the band cable face pull are another one of those like relatively small range of motion focused exercise just on shoulder movement. Then we get into the row exercises, X-band row, body weight row, and single arm row, where we're starting to put the shoulder joint into the compound movement with the rest of the upper body, just like we're going to require of it when we go row. So that would sort of be the intermediate level. And then the barbell row and the chin up and push-ups and overhead presses are a more advanced form of being able to move your shoulders through all the different ranges of motion as part of the rest of the system. I don't use the barbell row and the chin up as much as I used to, because I find that especially with tall, long limbed rowers, they're just really hard exercises to do correctly. So I've got some examples in the next videos the same way as I did for the hip hinge, and we'll go through each of those. But I spend the vast majority of my time in between the YWT raise and the single arm row, occasionally dipping into the barbell row and the chin up with more advanced athletes. And then everybody does a lot of push-ups and overhead press variations at an appropriately challenging level for them. All right. So again, just our friend, the YWT raise. I use this one with all athletes. I call this like the flossing of rowers. And by that, I mean the dental hygiene, not the dance, in that it doesn't really matter exactly how we do it, just as long as it's getting done. So I use it in the warm up. I use it in the tail end of the workout for reps, for building those muscles. And we always do it with low load. We don't do a ton of load on this because it starts to shift it from those low and middle shoulder muscles into the upper shoulder muscles. So like the strongest athletes, when I was coaching the college program, would use like 10 or 15 pounds per hands top. I'll use a lot of just like body weight or really light dumbbells. So this is a really great one if you're in a minimalist equipment situation. This is the band to pull apart. Here we're trying to do that same motion, sort of similar to the T raise, but focusing on the rear shoulder and mid back areas. Here I'm doing it wrong. You see me again, like I'm kicking the shoulders up first before I start to move the arms. On the face pull, we can do this with bands, or if you have access to a cable machine, similar exercise. I'm gonna show it wrong too in a second here. Or again, kick the shoulders up into it first before we actually start drawing the arms through. So we always want to be doing it around a stable shoulder joint, and then movement at the arms. So those are like my big three of shoulder coordination and the sort of like isolation exercises that I use for this. Then we get into the rows. The X band row is one of my absolute favorites. That's this one, because we can train what does this position look like to people. It should look like your release. So we can get, especially if you're spending time sculling now, we can even turn the hands over the other way and focus on drawing the thumbs directly into the rib cage. But this is one that I'll work a lot with on athletes who struggle with the release. And I find this a really great way to build strength in the arm and shoulder muscles to maintain pressure on the blade through the release. A lot of times athletes will be really good at pressure at the front end of the mid drive, but then they start to lose it toward the end. This is where the biceps and the back muscles really come into play. And very, very minimal equipment required if you have bands and a place to attach them. So here's wrong, right? We've got the elbows flared out, the shoulders up and rounded forward, and coach is saying, sit up, sit up. Now we're going the other way with a lot of back extension, not doing it from the shoulders and the arms. So there's correct. So I'm always trying to use these little like ways that we can teach the same stroke lessons while strength training. Here's the towel row or the inverted body weight row. If you have TRX or barbells or something, you could do it inverted body weight. This is one of my favorites. It's in the minimalist program with the beginners, and I'll use it with rowers of all levels too. We can make it harder or easier. Here's easier because I'm standing slightly more upright. The range of motion is a little bit smaller, but we're still working the same skills of keeping the shoulders down, moving through the whole range of motion. Here I'm making it harder by increasing the range of motion and my torso decline. So I love this exercise because we can adjust it between athletes really quickly. It also teaches tight torso connection. So we've got a nice straight line from heels to hips to back of the head. So I'm going to just go through that one more time. And looking for how the shoulder joint stays stable while we draw the hands through. The towel row is also a great grip developer. So forearm muscles, grip strength. I'll use the towel row a lot for that too. And again, not much equipment required, just a towel and somewhere that you can hang off. I even had one client who was doing it off of like a telephone pole, and she would use her rest intervals to go run out and get on the telephone pole for it. Here's the one arm row. If you've got dumbbell or kettlebell, this is great for that. Again, same thing. We've got the nice stable shoulder joint, then the arm draw, not the other way around as I'm showing now, where the shoulder joint kicks up before the arm draw actually happens. So I'm showing the errors on here just to make sure that the consistency of it is coming through. And here's the barbell row. Again, not one that I love to use with rowers, but if all you have is a barbell, then we got to find a way to use it. So here we're going to be focusing on using the same hip hinge technique that we want. We don't want sloppy back angle, really rounded over, because again, there we're putting more pressure on our spine and on our shoulder joint, not on the muscles. So think hinge and think the same shoulder movements that we've been talking about all day here. Here's bad, right? Now I've got a lot of spinal movement going on. I'm kicking the shoulder into it first. So here's the pull down. I really like to use band pull downs with athletes because we can work on that. The shoulder, the scapulohumeral rhythm happens vertically as well as horizontally. So we've been focusing mostly on the horizontal emphasis because that's how we do it on the erg and how we can do it in a lot of our strength training exercises. But it happens vertically too, where we want to keep the shoulder back and down while the arm goes up around a stable shoulder joint. So here's wrong. And this is what I so often see on chin-up exercises with rowers is rounded over, the shoulder going up first before the arms, little turtle shells. That is not what I want to see when we're actually on the water. So here I'm just showing like how we can move the shoulders without moving the arms as well. I'll go back to that here. And this is a nice one to practice, just going up into that fully extended position and then just focusing on shrugging the shoulders up and down, too far back. Here we're doing bad chin-ups again. Here we go. So there's shoulders up versus shoulders down. So we can start to, again, like train in those different movements and then help the athlete put it all together when we get the arm movement in there too. The pressing motions are another way that the shoulder movement comes into play. So here I'm showing good push-up technique. And then here's bad. So it's the same thing that happens with the rowing exercises, but just in reverse, where the shoulder kicks up first and rounds forward, and then the arm starts to move. So here I'm just demonstrating like the good and then the bad. So shoulders back and down versus shoulders up and forward. Let me go back to that one more time, because if you have trouble with your push-up, that's a really good way to, again, like feel it wrong in that position, up and rounded, and then feel it right, shoulders back and down, back to where I was. If you have trouble with the push-up, I much prefer to use the elevated push-up, which I'm going to demonstrate next, than to use like the push-up from the knees, which just changes it more. And I always tell the story about I was coaching one rowing camp last summer, and I had the like strength training time while they rotated around from ergs and water and other stuff. And I asked all the athletes one thing that they wanted to learn. And this one young woman said that she wanted to learn how to do a push-up right because her coach was always telling her that her push-up technique sucks. And I said, well, okay, cool. Let's see what we're working with. And so she went down to the floor and she did one of the push-ups with, you know, the elbows flared out, shoulders up and rounded forward, and only about half range motion. She obviously just wasn't strong enough to be able to do a push-up from the floor. We put her into this position on the elevated push-up with like a plyo block or a plyo box. You can get like 36 inches up or off of a bench like this, or find a spot around your house where you can do it. And she did a perfect push-up. Elbows came in, shoulders stayed back and down. She went through the whole range of motion. So it's just, we need to pick exercises that are appropriately challenging for the athletes, not just expect them to be able to get it down as we pile on reps and fatigue. So really important for especially younger athletes to start with this appropriately challenging variation, get it down, and then move on to the floor later on. If we can't do good reps here, then it's going to be really hard to build it in like a max strength environment from the floor. So I like the elevated push-up. Again, we can see all the same fundamental movements as the push-up from the floor, that we can gradually drop the athlete's hand height down. All right, so overhead presses are basically just reverse chin-ups or reverse pull-downs, right? Instead of pulling down, we're pushing up. So all the same shoulder fundamentals are still in play here. We want to keep the shoulder back and down. We want that to happen before the arm kicks up. So here I'm going the other way. I'll back that up here. Show the good technique first from the half kneeling overhead press, shoulder staying back and down. One way that I'll see bad technique identified right away is when the bell starts to go way far in front. Goodness. Sorry about my video jumping around. Anyway, you see the bell kick out in front, and that's sort of a dead giveaway that the athlete's shrugging the shoulder up before the arm is moving. So we use the overhead press to teach the same lessons, just in a different plane of movement and a different way of moving. I like the half kneeling overhead press because it helps the athlete feel really stable, connection from the glutes to the torso. Then we'll go to the standing press, maximum sweaty shirt here. But we're still looking for the same thing, shoulder back and down, pressing straight up, not the bad technique of the shoulder going up first before the arm moves. You see how that just looks awkward. And then there's the good technique again. Shoulder stays stable, back and down. The arm and the object moves around that stable shoulder. Here I'm just showing it from the side just so you can see it too. So I'm always cueing this stuff. Anytime we're doing hinge exercises, I'm cueing the same thing so that it's that much stronger when they get on the erg or on the water. And same thing when we're doing all these pressing, all the pulling exercises, cueing the same shoulder movements that I want the athlete to be thinking about when they're on the erg and on the water. So when I'm programming the hinge, again, I already went through like the exercise progression. First priority for beginners is practicing the movement. So we just got to get the hinge down so that they know that it's the hybrid in between the squat and the torso going forward, and they can find that movement reliably with their feet on the ground in a stable environment. Then we start to work on putting that together on the erg. So we do that in the warm-up, and we do it in land training, and we cue it when they're on the erg and when they're on the water. Land training, what I mean by land training is just like basic like circuit style workouts, but I much prefer to use land training to teach the movements first rather than just doing a ton of reps. If you're doing the 30-30 circuits from the beginner program, I've got hinges built in there. We'll talk about that in a second. Then for the intermediates, once they've got the movements down, we've practiced them, they can reliably find all those positions. We go to practicing and building. So now we're starting to use, again, we've got the hip hinge in the warm-up, and then in the strength training program, we've got what I refer to as one big hinge and one little hinge. So the big hinge would be like one of the exercises that we talked about before. We've got the Romanian deadlift with the barbell or with the 2 dumbbells. And then for the little hinge, what I mean by that is like the hip thrusts or body weight, one arm, one leg deadlifts. We're working through that movement, but not with a lot of load because we're still working on practicing while we build in the bigger environment. Then for advanced athletes, we're talking about building and performing. So now we're looking at adding strength and power, not just for the movement, but also seeing splits drop and the performance carry over to rowing. We always keep the hip hinge in the warm-up because we always just want to be accessing that again, making sure that athletes have that as a stable movement pattern when they go on the erg, on the water, and in strength training. We use one big or one bigger hinge if we have the opportunity to use an elevated deadlift or a hex bar, or with a lot of athletes, we'll just do more Romanian deadlifts. So we can always work that top part of the hinge. And then one little, again, so I'm always using kettlebell swing, hip thrust, single leg hip thrust, glute marching, all those exercises that you see in the strength training programs already. We're all trying to build up those posterior chain muscles through smaller, more focused efforts so that they can then be part of the bigger effort from the Romanian deadlift, the elevated deadlift, the hex bar deadlift, and then actually erging and rowing. On the shoulder, again, I take a slightly different approach, not quite so much of like a tiered progression, but we've got always the movement in the warm-up. So we're trying to do practice, mentally remember what those movements feel like between up, down, forward, backward, and then activation. So we're activating those little mid-back and shoulder muscles that often just don't get a lot of work otherwise. YWT or band pull apart are my favorites there, and you'll see those in the warm-up. I use the warm-up, that same warm-up that I have you doing for the strength training before the erg or before we get on the water. So that's our land warm-up too. Then we've got one push per session, and we train that for strength and power, either a push-up or an overhead press. So we're not doing a ton of reps there, tend to keep it below 10 reps, and we're just focusing on building strength and power from that good, stable shoulder position, but in the push movement. And then we've got one pull per session where we're working on building muscle and building movement comfort. So again, the row or the pull down variation, where we're doing the same or similar movement to what we want on the erg, we're going to keep shoulder down and then retract as we pull through with the arms. And then I have one shoulder per session where we again go for muscle and movement, and we get back into the YWT or the pull apart or the face pull exercise, where we're then just working on building up a really strong and stable shoulder whole area. So I found this to be a huge area of impact with rowers at all levels, because if our lower body's really powerful, but our shoulders are not as powerful, then that power is not getting from the lower body all the way through the torso to the shoulders to the handle. So it's really important for a long range of motion exercise like rowing that each of those muscles along that chain is strong and able to generate or transfer stroke force. So here, I just want to draw attention to a couple ways that this shows up in your training program. For the hip hinge specifically, we've got in the glute activation triple set with the hip thrust. Then we've got the band pull apart, face pull, or YWT raise to get into the shoulder coordination. The push-up plus, again, is the push-up motion plus that extra reach and round, and that gets into the 4 ways that the shoulder moves as well. And then the deep squat progression puts it all together, because it starts with the hip hinge, and then goes into the arms up and overhead in the Y position, where we're working the shoulders with the rest of the body, and then the straight stand up from there. So there's just a couple ways that I sneak some extra work in on the hip hinge and on the shoulder movements, while we also just generally get ready to train. And then in the strength training program, I'm just taking a couple snapshots of the different days of your training program. Again, push up, towel row, working on the shoulder coordination and building up the strength in those muscular areas and movements. And then the hip thrust, where we're working the hip hinge muscles, primarily the glutes. The founder hinge hold, with some athletes who have done the extra add-on, if you do have like a dumbbell or a kettlebell or something, then I'll add in a more of a moving hinge there, where we'll do like a single implement Romanian deadlift. Then we go over into the intermediate program. Again, we've got the half kneeling overhead press, because I assume you have some equipment to be able to do a dumbbell or a kettlebell or a landmine, which is the setup with the barbell overhead press. So there we're working on the same scapular rhythm, but going up and down. Push up, hands elevated push up, same thing. Towel or TRX inverted bodyweight row, getting the same shoulder motion in while we train the pulling muscles. Hip thrust, YWT raise, getting the posterior chain muscles of the glutes and the hamstrings and the hip hinge pattern. And then the YWT raise, where we put the hinge together with the shoulder movements. And then same thing with the advanced program. It's just slightly more advanced. So we go from the slightly lighter, more stable environment of the half kneeling overhead press into the one arm standing press, but we're working the same shoulder movement coordination that we want to see everywhere else. Romanian deadlift, we've got our slightly heavier hinge variation that we can use. One arm row, you saw that before. Band or cable pull apart. Again, we're coming back to hit those shoulder muscles one more time to work the general coordination. So that's how all of the stuff that we've just talked about shows up in the training program, so that we're building this in the warm-up. We're providing opportunities to practice it, get better at it, and build strength and muscle from those positions with the strength training. Then we've got all the cues that we're using also on the erg for the athlete to really dial in those good technical positions that are good for performance and reducing risk of injury. And then we've got the on-water rowing, where we hope we can put it all together for race day, where we want to be able to just call training. We've done all that focus work. Now we can just let it loose and see who's fastest. So that's my presentation. If you would like to see more from me, here's where you can find me. And I'm happy to take any additional questions at this time.
How long do you recommend doing each exercise? And I know you just talked about, this set takes about 30 minutes, but if they were going to do, just ITY raises before practice, before or after practice, how much time do you want them to spend on that?
Like three to four sets of 10 reps per movement is about my general volume.
Okay.
Because it's not, they're relatively small muscles, so we can't just thrash them and do a ton of work on them because they're just not big enough to really be able to soak up that work. The quads are one where it's like you can go row, you can do squats, they're big muscles. These little shoulder muscles, we're not loading them up real heavy and we're not doing real high volume. So what you'll see in most of the programs, here we can go back to that. It's not a ton of volume. And I don't have the set reps on here. Anyway, you can go look in the program and you'll see that it's not a ton of volume. It tends to be three to four sets of 10 to 20 reps tops. The YWT raise, I consider the reps to be each position. So we'll do 10 Ys, 10 Ws, and 10 Ts, and that's one set. So on the band pull aparts or the face pulls, there will go a little bit higher rep because we're just doing it, once.
Cool. All right. Questions rolling in. What do you think about the CrossFit way of training?
I think CrossFit is awesome as a sport, but that it's not the best way to train for rowing because rowing is its own sport and CrossFit's its own sport. So I love what CrossFit's done in terms of popularizing barbell training. Like they've done more to get barbell strength training into multiple populations than anything else in fitness history. But for rowers, I don't see a lot of benefit to like the really high effort AMRAP stuff. Because in CrossFit, it's counting reps and that's sort of the only thing that matters. Whereas in rowing, again, the reps only matter as much as that's going to carry over to your erging or rowing performance. So I tend to use a lot more movement quality work and a lot lower volume training with rowers than what I see in typical CrossFit programs. But CrossFit also varies a ton. So there's no like, this is what CrossFit is because it's sort of up to each gym to define how they do things. So you might have a really good CrossFit gym that can make those adaptations. But I would not use like straight workout of the day sort of material and think that that's going to make us the best rowers possible.
Great. Would you recommend deficit RDL?
Like where you're standing on a block or something? Typically I don't do that because we only RDL as far as we can maintain our hinge position. So as you saw in the videos, like I wasn't going until the plates hit the floor or something, because that's going to depend on how tall you are, how long your arms are, how flexible your hips are, all these other factors. So with the RDL, we just go down as far as the athlete can hip hinge. When you can't hip hinge anymore, don't just bend your back forward because that is like coming up into the catch and then bending your back forward more. So we want to use like transferable lessons. Now, if you're a shorter athlete and you do run out of room before you can actually get through your whole hip hinge, then sure, go ahead and stand up on something. But only insofar as the goal of training the hip hinge, not just increasing range of motion for the sake of increasing range of motion.
Great. Which part of the abs should rowers focus on, and what are some good exercises for that?
Ooh, yeah. So that unfortunately had to be another webinar for another day of ab training or core training. I will, just because it's different than what we're going through here with the hip hinge and the shoulder stuff. I will say that I like planks and other basic stuff for just plain old development of the abdominal muscles. But for rowers, there's an exercise on my YouTube channel called the seated rock back that I really like because it puts the athlete in a very similar position, either on a stability ball, a bench, or a plyo box to the release position. And then they keep pressure down through the heels. And then they've got to rock back basically from the 11 o'clock to the 1 o'clock position around the back end of the stroke. I find that trained for reps has much better carryover to how the trunk muscles actually function in the rowing stroke rather than the planks and the sit-ups and the stuff like that. That is not actually how the abdominal muscles function when we row. So there's the super short version, but you're also welcome to email me and I can send you links and more information about that.